Hey, it's Sonia, and welcome to the Smarta Podcast. Hi, welcome back on the Smarta Podcast. Today I wanted to start off with a quick fact that I think sums up today's discussion and will instantly place you on the type of perspective that we're going to approach today. Did you know that only 14% of parents describe their adolescent with positive words, and 59% describe them with negative phrases? I want to go ahead and introduce this brilliant guest onto today's episode. Ellen Galinsky is the president of Families and Work Institute and the elected president of the Work and Family Researchers Network. She also serves as Senior Research Advisor to AASA, the school superintendent organization. Previous jobs include Chief Science Officer at the Bezos Family Foundation and faculty at Bank Street College. Her research has focused on work-life, child and adolescent development, youth voice, childcare, parent-professional relationship, and parental development. Galinsky is the author of Mind in the Making, a best-selling book on early learning that the New York Times called an iconic parenting manual. Her book on adolescence, The Breakthrough Years, was published in March 2024 and involved 9 years of research, including 3 original studies. She's also the author of 90 books and reports and 360 articles for books, academic journals, magazines, and the web. A popular keynote speaker, Galinsky has been a presenter at 5 White House conferences, including the White House Conference on Teenagers in 2000. She has been featured regularly in the media, including appearances on Good Morning America, The Today Show, and The Oprah Winfrey Show. Hi, Ellen. Welcome to the Smarta Podcast.
I'm thrilled to be with you.
All right, let's dive right in. Ellen, you've published more than 40 books and researches, and I truly find mesmerizing. And I have to ask you if you could talk right now directly with a person listening, be it a teenager, a student, or a parent. If they're going to listen to what you have to share with us here today, what are the 3 main key takeaways that they're going to learn that they can implement into their lives?
That's a great question to start. They're going to learn that adolescence, which is defined as, I started at 9 because puberty starts about then, but 9 or 10 or so, up through the time where young people leave home and go out on their own in the world, is a time of very rapid and important brain development. It's a time that's called a sensitive period, which means that we're more responsive to the influences of our environment than other times. It's a time of enormous possibility. So you talk about people starting their careers. It's a time when we begin to figure out who we are, whom we want to be. And it's a time also of vulnerabilities. That's one takeaway, the enormous brain development that's happening. The second takeaway is that there are a set of essential skills that are developing both in the early years, but particularly during the adolescent years, which will set us up for success now and in the future. And I'll share those. And the third thing that I'll share is that the way we see young people, we often see young people in negative ways, which doesn't really conform to the real potential that young people have. And that there are things that if we see them differently, we can do things differently. So this part is addressed to the adults in young people's lives. If we promote autonomy, if we promote skills, but do so in a way that builds on the competencies of young people, we can really have less conflict and have a much better relationship and also set them up for success.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that. I really appreciate that you mentioned that you start adolescence all the way from 9, because especially in today's world, I look back to when I was young and I published my first book at 10 and I see what children are capable of. And I absolutely agree with what you have to say, that it's a time of rapid brain development, and that today we're going to tackle why it's so important to listen to the younger people because they have so much to share. Ellen,
what was your book at 10? I have to ask.
It was a poetry book about all the things I was discovering. Thank you. And Ellen, let's dive into your book, which I have here with me today, The Breakthrough Years, which challenges many common assumptions about adolescence. And I saw it was based on a lot of extensive research. Can you tell me a little bit more about it in a nutshell? Because there's so many things to unpack. But right now, just as we begin the podcast, any key messages that you hope parents to take away from it?
Well, you asked me how I did this book, and I always start with people who are going to be in research language, you would call them the subjects of a study. But for me, they're the co-creators of anything I do. So I started first, and this was in 2015, so it took me 9 years. I started by talking to 14 to 18-year-olds, just by chance that those are the ages, but to young people themselves, and asked them what they wanted to know about their own development. So I started with their questions, and that took me in a very different direction than I thought I would go. I interviewed leading developmental researchers, both in the United States and other parts of the world, particularly cognitive neuroscientists, because I think understanding the brain in the context of psychological and social development adds so much to our knowledge. In my study, then, I did 2 nationally representative studies of 9 through 19-year-olds because I really wanted to see if what I was hearing in the interviews that I did when I started out were similar or different from what I found of a nationally representative group in the United States. And I also wanted to share adolescents' voices. I wanted people not to hear from me, just me, or from researchers, but I wanted them to hear from young people themselves. It's a book that really tries to capture the voices, the wishes, the wants, the desires of young people. And then I also did qualitative interviews with 60 people, about 60 people, parents and kids, from the nationally representative studies, as well as a behavioral study of executive function. So a lot of studies went into this, and my overwhelming job was to put it all together in ways that were read well, read like a novel, I hoped, because I think the stories of young people are so compelling, and yet shared brain information and shared what you can do.
Absolutely. And this is one of those things where I really want to emphasize about your book in specific, because I was skimming through it before we hopped on here today on podcast. And I really want to draw attention to how the quotes are kept the way they were, and you didn't paraphrase them. I just think that's brilliant. And I'm lucky to always be described positively by my mother, looked up with admiration, not everything that I could be. And I found the results on how we think about the adolescent brain mind really mind-blowing, that only 14% of parents describe their adolescents with positive words and 59 describe them with negative phrases. Why do you
Well,
think that is?
yeah, the question was actually a generic question. I think more people describe their own teenagers in positive words, but the question was, what words or phrase come to mind when you think of the teen brain, or the adolescent brain? So I wanted to get the overall conception of adolescence, because that's what young people wanted me to find out. They told me in focus groups, why don't people like teenagers? Why don't they understand us, and why don't they like this? I mean, that's what I heard in the focus groups, which was not at all what I planned to study. But, when you listen, then you have to follow the direction that people set. So I wanted to find out if what the few people I talked to were saying, if that was true, on a larger scale. And other studies had shown, there was a study in 1987 when people were just asked to use words to describe teenagers, and they were overwhelmingly, I think only 12% were negative there. So, a different question. But what I did find, which was very disturbing to me, was that if parents use negative words about the average teenage brain, even when I controlled for the words that they used to describe their own teenager, that is, I took out all the negative words that they used to describe their own teenagers, and I took out of the analyses the amount of conflict that they had with their parents, both as reported by the parents and as reported by the child. And then I looked 9 months later, went back 9 months later to the same people. I found that parents who used negative words were more likely to have young people who were sad, lonely, depressed. So, it's a correlation. It's not causal, but clearly says to me that it matters. Also, the actual words that people used was also very telling to me, because they said, why don't they like us, but why don't they understand us? And I was trying to figure that out, by all the methods of research that I was using. The most frequent word that parents used to describe the adolescent or teen brain was immature. 11% used that exact word. Another 8% use words that mean immature, like undeveloped, underdeveloped, unfinished, words like that. And so altogether, close to 1 in 5, 2 in 10, parents use words that says we're looking at the teenager as a deficit adult. They're what they're not. They're not an adult. They're not themselves. And this is a stage of development where we're biologically primed to do certain things. And it said to me that kids are right. We don't understand them. We adults don't understand them if we're seeing them as deficit adults. We don't think of infants as deficit toddlers. We don't think we understand more or less that stage of development. We don't think of toddlers as deficit preschoolers. We more or less understand that stage of development. But a lot of us are thinking negatively about teenagers, and a lot of us are thinking of them as not being a mature person.
As the teen brain is really all over the place, full of chaos, a lot of different changes, and I completely agree. But there's some beauty added to that, I think, as well, especially as your book focuses on teens that are thriving in their lives. And one aspect, which is the importance of listening to your children and how that can completely change the outcome of when they grow up and what they end up to be in their lives. And that makes me want to ask you, do you think vocalizing our emotions, our frustrations, what we're going through, even if it's not a psychiatrist, be it to our mom or our friends, can harbor a more intellectual individual?
Yes. I mean, I think we don't want to drown in emotions, but we don't want to throttle them up either. So absolutely expressing what you feel, first of all, to understand that it's normal. You're not the only one. And I think that's a big part of being a teenager, where you think no one else feels this way, or you wonder if they do, like if you don't get invited out, all the girls are going to, I'm thinking of a Taylor Swift song, all the girls are going to the to the mall, and you're not, and you call them up and they say they're busy, and then you go to the mall with your mom and they're all there, and you go, I wasn't invited. That feels like it didn't happen to anyone else, but it does. And so understanding those kinds of experiences as normal, I think, is really important. Also, if you can name it, you can tame it, is one way that people talk about it here in the United States, which is if you can understand your feelings, then you can manage them. And so expressing your feelings is important. What a lot of young people told me, 21% said parents don't understand. This is, again, open-ended questions, which in response to my question to young people, which is, what should adults know about people your age? 21% say adults don't understand us. And 9% said talk with us, not at us. And in the open-ended questions that I ask, again, of people I don't know, a nationally representative survey, so many people said that the way we talk to teenagers doesn't help. Like if we say, oh, stop being such a teen. Well, wait a minute. You are a teen. You should be a teen. No, you're not going to stop being who you are. This is the stage of life you're in. You're supposed to explore. You're supposed to have quick reactions. You're supposed to feel things deeply. How else would you know whether you're safe or not safe? How else would you know whether you belong in this group or you don't belong in this group? How else would you know what you need to learn to be able to be on your own in the future? So it's like that bird leaving the nest. We We need to explore, we need to react strongly so that we keep ourselves safe and begin to figure out our place in the, in this new expanding world. So when we say things like, oh, you'll get over it, or I went through that and it was nothing, we're diminishing what people are feeling. So there's a lot of suggestions that come from young people in the book about how we can talk in a way that helps young people want to talk to us. When I ask young people for most important parenting skills or strategies, they and parents said open communication. And so, these aren't trivial. This is what young people and parents see as the key to a good relationship. And so I think listening to young people about how we can open up a conversation in ways that don't make people feel, young people feel like, I'm not talking to you ever again, forget it. I think that's important.
And I want to bring you back to something that you said, which is these parents that adopted the mentality that the children are immature actually were to end up having the children that would behave in that way. And I want to link that to many parents considering that actually involving them in a lot of extracurricular activities and providing the basic needs for them is what develops their brains over quality time and really listening to their children. And in your book, you focus on the 5 basic psychological needs, which are caring, connections, agency, mastery, identity, and purpose. Can you talk to me a little bit about these 5 and how they can be implemented to parents so they can change maybe the way that they approach their child when they did something bad?
There was a theory at the time that I was doing this book that was very much in all of the journals, academic journals, which is that there's a mismatch between the development of the reward system in the brain and the development of the cognitive control system. And that mismatch was really so important to understand in adolescent development. Well, as you go deeper and in the years since that theory came out, there are truths to that. That is true for some young people, but it's not true for all young people. But it really bothered me because it's also a negative way of looking at growth. It's like you're a faulty car and your gas pedal works, but your brakes don't. It's a negative way. It I think breeds a culture again where we think negatively, talk negatively, see negatively. And that's not helpful. So I kept thinking, so I was very consumed with better understanding that at the point when I first started my study. And I was talking to one researcher, this was the second actually interview that I did, and I was talking about this theory about the mismatch. And then I went, whoa, wait a minute. The real mismatch is not between the different parts of the brain. The real mismatch is between the environments that we provide for them and what they need. And in that, I was looking at a lot of research about where adolescents' brains are most activated. If you're rejected, your brain is very activated, more so than a younger child, more so than someone just a bit older than you. And those, if you feel that you can't be who you are, that really activates your brain. You feel your stereotype for who you are. That really activates your brain. If you feel that you're seen as not competent, those things are where the brain gets really activated. And I went, well, this sort of took me back to a theory that's long and important, long held and important and very tested in psychology, which is called self-determination theory. Self-determination, the basic idea of self-determination theory is that we have basic psychological needs, just like we have physical needs. We have the physical needs for food, water, shelter, those things. But we have psychological needs in self-determination theory. It's relatedness, that is our relationships with other people. It's having some autonomy, which is feeling choiceful. It's not being completely independent, not doing your own thing, but it means not feeling coerced, but feeling choiceful. That's true in the adult research that I used to do. Having autonomy was always predictive of health and, every positive or negative outcome I wanted to look at. And third, feeling that you're competent, having competence, being seen as competent. And so I then looked at the basic needs, the places where adolescents' brains were most activated, and I added two to that list, and I sort of expand the way that I describe it. So relatedness for me became caring connections. It involves the feeling that you belong, but also being supported. What is called autonomy for me became agency, which is feeling that you are, in a sense, have choice over your life, which involves being treated with respect as well as having some autonomy. These are all things that people give to us. These are all things that the environment does for us. These are not things we can want to belong, but if we're in an environment that rejects us, we can't belong. We can't just belong in our own minds. It has to do with the relationships that we have. The third one, which they call competence, I called mastery, because I also see it as involving challenge. It's competence, but it's also feeling that you're stretched, that you can grow. You know, it's not just, oh, you're good at everything. It's like tackling something. That's when we feel the most excited about learning, is when we feel we're stretched and growing. Being able to be who you are, which is the main task of being a teenager. You know, it's figuring out who you are, trying on different, identities and figuring out which ones seem to fit and which ones don't. And finally, what I call purpose, but by that I mean doing things that are meaningful. By purpose, I mean doing things that are meaningful and being able to contribute. That is, to be able to make the world a better place. It may be bringing food to your grandmother. It doesn't mean that you're working on some big social cause. It can be just the little thing that you help someone who is sitting alone at the cafeteria, but it's all about making the world a better place. So what I did was I took those 5 basic needs and I asked questions about to what extent those needs were met by the people in adolescents' lives, by their family, by their friends, by the people at school, by the people in their out-of-school activities, and online. So those 5 environments. And were they treated with respect? Did they feel that they belonged? Did they feel that people had their back? In other words, they were supported. Did they feel that they were challenged to grow and learn? Did they feel that they could make a contribution? Those needs, again, you could see they were pretty simple questions. I mean, they were, as standardized as questions as I could do, but they were pretty, because other people have measured this. And then I went back during the pandemic, and I found when I controlled for everything that I could possibly control for, our team put very big statistical controls on our data. We found that young people who had their basic psychological needs met before the pandemic were doing actually pretty well during the pandemic in all of the outcomes we looked at. We looked at their grades. We looked at, mental health, whether or not they felt stressed. We looked at whether or not they had conflict with their parents or not. We looked at whether they were engaged in school and learning at school, a whole series of outcomes. And that just was amazingly predictive. So I think that it's just important for us to all understand. I hear a lot of talk about belonging, but it's as if the child should be the one who belongs. No, it's the adults or the other people in our children's lives that can make or not make people feel that they belong. I think there's a societal responsibility, particularly in schools. It's not trivial. It's key to learning. If we have classrooms where kids feel that they belong, where they feel supported, all those things, that's just what teachers should do. That's the environment that they should create, and they should think about creating that environment. And then, because kids are looking for that. I did a focus group with 7th graders in Chicago once, and it was near the beginning of school. The head of the Chicago Public Schools was there. He later on became our Secretary of Education in the United States. And we were talking to young people, and a 7th grader said in the focus groups, I can tell from the way that I walk into the room the first day of school whether I'm going to, in a class, I'm going to tell whether it's going to be a good class or not. Oh, and I said, whoa, the first day of school, the first minute you see the teacher. I said, what are you looking at? And he said, the teacher's eyes. I can tell from the teacher's eyes whether that teacher likes kids or not, whether that teacher wants to be here or not, whether that teacher wants to be teaching this subject or not, and that's going to affect whether or not I have a good class.
Wow. Wow, I agree. And
Yeah,
actually, I truly believe that the environment that you surround yourself in can really change how you grow up and how you develop your brain. And I think it's a very pivotal moment now, especially as I'm reading your book, that you highlight these five essential executive function-based skills that can help teens succeed. And you've talked to me about these five psychological things that you can do to help parents make their child feel more like they belong. But what about these five essential executive function-based skills that are important for adolescents to thrive?
I wrote a book called Mind in the Making, which started out with a question of mine, which is why are so few kids engaged in school and in learning?
Mhm,
I had found that in focus groups that I was doing for another study, and I
mhm,
wanted to understand that, and I went to look at early research. So it was, and then I found that the kids who were most likely to learn, to thrive in school, were the kids who had these neurocognitive skills. And that was like, a wowie finding. This was, oh gosh, 20 years ago now. I'd been doing this research for a little while, and I began to see that across academic disciplines that these were the kids who thrived. And I started out with 7 skills in the book that I wrote based on this called Mind in the Making. And I think, the research has advanced in the decade and a half since Mind in the Making was published. So I ended up consolidating some of those skills, and there's just more that we know. So it ended up with 5 skills. So executive function, that's a word that I don't know. Did you know that word before?
no.
Yeah, most people don't. I'll often ask for a show of hands if I'm speaking. How many people have heard of executive function? Sometimes a lot, but even when they've heard of it, they think of it as shut up and sit still. These are
Mm,
skills that make us comply, or they think of it as soft skills. They're not, they're neurocognitive skills. They're the most neurocognitive skills, they mostly emanate from the prefrontal cortex, which is, the height of learning and so forth. And they might think of them as 21st century skills,
mhm,
those sorts of things. So what are they? It's an umbrella concept, which means that it's defined by behavior rather than the behavior, they're all attention regulation skills. It's what we pay attention to. So there are 4 skills so I would say focus is the umbrella. And
mhm,
under that come working memory, which means that you're using what you know. You're being able to draw on your experience. You're in a new situation, you're going to a new place, but you've been to new places before, so you're drawing on what you know. Thinking flexibly. Things don't happen the way you expect. People don't act the way you thought they would. So you've got to respond to the changing circumstances. You've got to be flexible. Then there's reflection. That actually takes place in a different part of the brain than the prefrontal cortex, largely. The default network versus the cognitive control network. But that means, daydreaming, stepping back, thinking, reflecting, pausing. We can do it in an instant. It doesn't have to mean, long hours of daydreaming, but it means that you pause before you act. You think about it. You monitor what you're doing. You think about, is this the right way to talk to this new person when I go to a new place? And then you use self-control because maybe you want to say, I think your hat is ugly. I don't know. I'm making it up. Or why do you have a stain on your shirt? But
mhm,
that's the first time you're meeting someone, so you might not want to say that. So you use self-control because your goal is, these are all goal-driven behaviors. Your goal is to go to that event or that party or that meeting or wherever you're going and get the most out of it. So, these are always goal-directed behaviors, big goals, little goals, but they're always goal-directed behaviors. That's why I think they're so important. And they become the building blocks of other skills that I call life and learning skills, which are things like perspective taking, that is understanding how other people think and feel, or collaborating, or communicating. Communicating means that you don't just say anything you think about how you use perspective taking, and you think about how it's going to be heard, and you think about what messages you want to say, and then you communicate. Critical thinking, which is figuring out what's valid and accurate information. All of those skills are built on those basic core executive function skills. In the time that I've been looking at this, the research is growing and growing and growing, that these skills are the most predictive of our success, not only in school, but in life. Now, that is, you could be a 5-year-old, you could be a 12-year-old, you could be an 18-year-old, you could be a 40-year-old, you could be a 60-year-old. They're the most predictive of our success now and in the future, overwhelmingly so, from health, wealth. There's one study that was done in Dunedin, New Zealand, of all of the kids, about 1,000 kids born in a certain year. And they followed those kids in one of the latest papers is until they're 32 years old, and found that the kids who had self-control were healthier and wealthier at 32 than the kids who didn't have self-control when they were 4 years old.
Really?
Controlling again for everything. So these skills are highly, highly, highly predictive.
I've learned a new word now, executive function, which I just learned that will determine my success in life in terms of health and wealth. That's a thing to look out for.
Yeah, and when you think about it, the next time you're in a challenging situation, you're not just on automatic, but you're something, you have to drive a new direction or something. And you just watch yourself, step back and watch yourself, and you'll see how you're using these skills. It's just kind of phenomenal. I think of it, I'm going to hold up my glasses now. I think of it as seeing the world through executive function glasses. I didn't see them before I knew about this, but now when I look at what helps people do well in a situation versus not do well, I can see that they're using executive function skills over and over and over and over and over again. So I'd like parents and teachers and any one of us, when we think about our own success, to think about these skills, like not going on automatic, not eating that extra piece of chocolate cake if you're on a diet, those sorts of things, be intentionally helping kids learn that. We've just mostly left it to automatic, but I think we need to be much more conscious about helping kids learn. And if you also, another way that was just kind of wonderful to me was it's in the culture, the games that get passed down from generation to generation, like Simon Says. Simon Says is a perfect executive function skill. You have to remember the rules. The rule is that you have to do it. You can't do anything unless Simon says to do it. You've got to think flexibly. You've got to pause, and you have to use self-control. There it is. Those games were teaching us those skills, which is why I think they've stuck around for so many, generations after generations. But I think we could also be more intentional about helping kids learn those skills.
So executive functions have been present in our everyday routines without us acknowledging them. It's pretty interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, like amazing. What I love about research is that it makes you see your everyday experience in new ways.
It changes your perspective, definitely. And you talk about the shared solutions framework in your book. Can you explain what this is and how parents can use it to turn daily conflicts with their teens into opportunities for problem solving?
Yep, skill building. Yes. This is something, shared solutions is something that I kind of stumbled into as a teacher. I was a teacher, as my first job. And I had a child named Isabel and we were in New York City, and we would go out to the park. And as soon as it was time to leave, Isabel would climb to the top of the jungle gym. And there was another teacher, so I wasn't alone with this group of kids. But what am I going to do? How am I going to get Isabel down to come back to school? Am I going to climb up the playground and try to grab her? That's probably not going to work well. So I have to figure out a way to do that. And what I discovered was that if we had a meeting with the children to say, here's a problem I've been having, Isabel doesn't want to leave when it's time to leave. So she goes to the top of the playground. She told me she didn't want to leave. And so what ideas do all of you have to help Isabel when it's time to leave? Because we're all going to go. It's time to go back to school. So what ideas do you have? So every child would come up with an idea. I'd write them down, and then I'd say, what would work about that idea for me, the teacher, and what would work about that idea for Isabel or not work? And then we have to pick one that would work for Isabel and work for the teacher. So there's steps in that. You name the problem, you're making meaning, which is an executive function skill. 2, you're thinking creatively, which is an executive function skill. You're thinking of as many ideas as you can. 3, you're evaluating, you're using perspective taking. What would work about that? What wouldn't work about that? Then use critical thinking to figure out, what's the best one? What's the one that would work for everyone? And that's the process of problem solving, which is an executive function skill. So in this thing I lucked into when I was a teacher, I figured out that, then I used it with my children, and it worked very well with my children. And then as I learned about executive function skills, I could see why it worked well. Because you think about if your boss tells you everything to do, you're probably not going to want to do it as much as if you're a part, as one child said to me, if we're the problem, then we need to be part of the solution. We need to be teaching kids skills. So what this does is teach kids skills, and for them to move out into the world. It's turning a conflict or a problem or a challenge into an opportunity to promote a skill. You're helping children learn how to solve problems themselves. You're not fixing it for them. You're stating the rule. You're not being wishy-washy. There's a rule. You have to come in. Or in my case of my children, you can't fight with each other in the backseat of the car when you're driving. But they were learning skills for how to deal with conflict. I wasn't just saying, be good and, shut up and we share and we don't talk to our sister that way. And, I was actually helping them learn skills.
I think that's one of the most valuable things a parent could do. And I think the shared solutions framework works so well because it makes every person's idea get a voice. And I think that's I've never thought of it that way. Now you broaden my perspective. And it's a really efficient way, I believe, to tackle a conflict or a solution. And that links us on very well because I want to bring you into the direction of social media, which you tackle in the book a little bit. And it's actually, you mention it as being a positive influence for teens rather than a negative one. How can parents help their children use social media in a healthy way?
Both. It's both. Social media, I was pretty clear to say that there aren't, again, as the book was, in print before the latest report in the United States came out, but I pretty much say the exact same thing, which is social media can hurt some children, can harm, but the relationship is more correlational than causal. But it also can benefit some children. In fact, I think it could potentially benefit all children if we use it in ways to teach skills, as we've just been talking about. And if you could use social media as a way to not just be a consumer, but to be a creator, and if you can use it in socially positive ways, I think podcasts, I've been on a number of podcasts like this by young people, for young people, like what you do. And that's a fabulous use of social media. You're making the world a much better place.
Thank you. I really want to, yeah. I introduced the concept of the possibilities mindset, which I really like in the book. And if you could please explain it to me and how it can benefit not only teens, but also their parents.
Okay, possibilities mindset. Again, I didn't set out to discover a new mindset. What I wanted to understand was you can have wonderful skills like shared solutions, and you can know that you want to use them, but your kid totally infuriates you, and you end up screaming, if you do that again, I will never, or you will, or you're an awful. I wanted to understand why parents lose it and what was going on. So I interviewed a number of parents, and the parents that came from the nationally representative sample, and I asked them to tell me about a time when they lost it with their child, meaning not necessarily screaming or throwing things or yelling, but not being the parent that they wanted to be. And And I asked them to describe it blow by blow. This happened, you felt this, you said this, and then what did you do? And then how did your child react? And then what did you feel? What did you think? What did you do? How did your child react? Blow by blow. And what I found is that there were three things going on. The first is, and this is Carol Dweck's amazing work on growth mindset or a fixed mindset, that there's either the belief that things can change or things can't change. A growth mindset means that you think that intelligence isn't set in stone, it can be changed. A fixed mindset thinks you're born with the intelligence that you'll have and that can't be changed, so forth. So that's one thing. The second thing that was important, though, is whether you saw it as a threat or whether you saw it as a challenge. If you saw it as a threat, then you were likely to go into, parents were likely to go to, I'll say we are likely to go into a we, they, fight or flight kind of a stress reaction.
Mm-hmm.
If we see it as a challenge, that's different. We feel like it's something that we could begin to solve. And that was really important. In fact, I think we need to teach young people or ourselves to lean into stress, to understand the difference between a threat and a challenge and how we can manage those. And then the third thing that was going on is self-efficacy, which is a psychological term, which probably not many people know, but whether or not we feel we have the capacity to solve a problem. You can see that things could change. You could see it as a challenge, but you could just say, I don't think I can do it. And so I found that all three of those mattered. All three of those mindsets kind of go together to form what I call a possibilities mindset or an adversity mindset, which is the opposite. And we've been teaching them this to teachers, and we've seen that it makes a huge difference in their teaching, in their well-being, in their skills, So I'm excited. It's the kind of beginning of this journey, but I think we're onto something. This is with my colleague Phil Zalazzo at the University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Self-efficacy. That's a new term I also learned today. And
Yeah, there's so much jargon in psychology, in any field.
mm-hmm. And it's really interesting to see how it can actually shift your perspective. And you mentioned adolescence as often being seen as this period of increased risk taking. How can parents encourage positive risk taking in their children, such as standing up for themselves when they're in a bad situation at school or in volunteering and helping their communities?
Oh, I love that. Most of the research on adolescence for decades has been on risk, negative risk. Why do teenagers do things like smoke or drink or,
Mm-hmm.
those sorts of things. And there was the feeling that adolescents were doing it because they didn't really understand the dangers. This is the research of Ron Dahl, who actually looked at the brain and found that the fear was very elevated in young people doing risky things. They understood the fear. It was overcoming the fear. It was learning to be brave that is so important. So all adolescents feel things more deeply than younger children or older adults. It's a time when they're very big feelings. The word that's being used a lot in the United States is that there are just a lot of big feelings during adolescence, and they're big feelings for a reason. We've talked about that. If we could harness that by giving adolescents real opportunities to learn to be brave, and it doesn't mean, just mountain climbing or something like that. It could mean standing up for a friend. It could mean taking a new course that you've never taken before. I think we ought to intentionally, we adults ought to give young people opportunities to learn to be brave, and to try little things where they see that they can overcome a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. And Ellen, we have this tradition here on the Smarta podcast where I asked the last guest to put a question for the next one. And my last guest was Dr. Laura Graziano Browning, and she left over this question for you. We are all born with a brain that longs to be special, yet we must all share the world with 8 billion others who want to be special just as much. How can children be taught to manage the inevitable disappointment that our natural urges create?
We can all still be special. Yes, we share the world with lots of people, but I think your mother thinks you're very special.
Yeah,
And
she
from what
does.
you told me, just briefly, and I think my two children and my two grandchildren are very special, each in a unique way. That doesn't mean entitled. That doesn't mean that you don't understand that you share the world with lots of people and you need to take their perspectives. I think the important thing is, Yuri Brofenbrenner, who is a well-known psychologist in the United States, says every kid needs someone who is just madly in love with them. And I think that I agree with there's just no research after research after research shows that everyone needs that we all thrive best if we're just someone is madly in love with us, our parents, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher, someone. And that, but then we need to learn the skill of perspective taking, and that skill means that we understand the thoughts and feelings of other people, and that skill can be taught. The skill of perspective taking, of communicating and collaborating, help us live in our social world. And I think we ought to intentionally teach young people those skills.
Mhm. Every kid needs someone that's madly in love with them. I really like that. It's very heartfelt. And Ellen, as any parting advice, what would you like to leave the listeners with if they will take to heart everything that you're about to just say now?
My dream for this book, and it was 9 years of my life, getting up every morning, before work, and writing for a couple of hours before I went to my job, which I loved too. I love my job, but a lot of years in this, and so I thought a lot about what do I hope from this book. And the reason I call it breakthrough years is that I hope that it is a breakthrough time. It's a time of enormous brain development, breakthrough possibilities. It's a breakthrough time in that researchers who used to just look at negative risks are now looking at positive risks, are looking at adolescence differently. My hope for this book is that it is a breakthrough time when we reframe the way we see young people and their possibilities. I think if we use what we know about development and we use what we know from the voices of young people, we can create a very different world.
That's a very beautiful to end this podcast, Ellen, and thank you so much for being on today. And I hope that, the person listening will go ahead and see the breakthrough years and pick it up, read it, because I think it's such a beautiful read with so much knowledge and wisdom that you poured your heart into, from what I can see. So I can't wait to finish this book. And thank you once again for being on this podcast, Ellen.
Thank you.
Before we continue, I want to talk to you briefly about this amazing organization called SOS Children's Villages. SOS Children's Villages Romania has been providing children in need with a safe, clean home, healthy food, a good education, and the love and the care that they need. I know they're literally saving children's lives, as I had the chance to donate books to them and sit down and talk with them. All donations are highly appreciated, and you can donate online to SOS Children's Villages Romania at the link in the description below and change a child's life forever. Before we wrap up, here's a simple exercise that you can try today. The Possibilities Mindset Journal Prompt. I would like you to take 10 minutes to reflect on a recent interaction with another adolescent, or if you're a parent, with your child. Then I want you to go ahead and write down one positive trait that you admire about them. And then do the opposite. So I want you to write down a challenging moment that you experienced with them recently. Now for the challenge, ask yourself and consider, did I respond from a place of emotional reaction or cognitive control? What alternative response could I try next time to foster connection or encourage their agency? And after doing this exercise, I want you to have a chat with either that adolescent or your child, whether it's something that they did well or a quality that you appreciate about them. Watch how this small shift starts creating more openness and connection between this relationship. So that's where I want to end today. I want to go ahead and ask you a favor. If you have a friend or a family member that you think will really enjoy this conversation, please go ahead and share this episode with them and leave a 5 stars review, because it's what helps us keep bringing you quality discussions and quality questions with quality guests to you. Now, before we hear each other again, I also want to take the opportunity to personally tell you that you are making progress. And if no one told you this today, I want to be the first one that tells you that I believe in you and your ability to create your dream life. See you next time. Thank you for listening to the Smarta Podcast.